We've been talking about the you and us, about community. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but there are times when we sort of can lean back and say, wow, I don't know what I can do in the kingdom other than just, I show up, I sit in my spot, but I'm not really gifted or I don't have a place to make a difference. And so we're trying to encourage ourselves to remember that God calls us as a community of faith to come together to be encouraged and strengthened, but the majority of our service to God doesn't happen in this building. I mean, this is the high point. This is the tip of the iceberg. This is the peak of the week. This is worshiping together. But what do we do for God Monday through Saturday? What does He want us to do with the other 6 days of the week? Those are places also where we've been called and gifted to serve and make a difference. So, if you were to get a church nickname, what would it be? If we stood you up here or we passed a piece of paper and we said, okay, everybody, let's come up with a name for Leland. What's his nickname going to be? What is that attribute that you know of? Or if we said, Brother Lynn, what would it be? Well, let's see. There was a man whose nickname was Barnabas. The church gave him the nickname because it meant son of encouragement. Talked about how there would never have been an Apostle Paul if there hadn't have been a Barnabas to encourage him. And there was a Silas. When the Apostle Paul was tired and hurting and fearful, that God used a young man named Silas and Timothy and some others to come around beside him and lift him up and encourage him. But most of us are familiar with the great servant Moses, who God used powerfully. The 10 plagues, manna from heaven, the parting of the Red Sea. But we forget sometimes that Moses was unable. You might argue unwilling, but the result is the same. And so God used his brother Aaron to be a spokesman, to stand next to him, to speak when Moses couldn't or wouldn't speak. If there hadn't been an Aaron, there wouldn't have been a Moses. Well, one of the places that we serve, Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2, we already talked about last week how we're individual stones that are built up to this house of God. But in verse 9, he says this, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that each one of us are called as priests." That's a word that means to be an intercessor, a bridge, a connector. The priest's job was to connect God and His people, to bring His people closer to Him. And that's what Aaron was, the first high priest under what we would call the Mosaical system. Aaron is the most famous example of the priest in the Scriptures. But you and I are also to be priests for this purpose, he says, the end of verse 9, to proclaim the excellencies of Him who has called you out of darkness into His marvelous light, that we're to connect others. Now, how do we do that? This is where God has gifted each of us. The way that you represent God, the where that you represent God, even the when that you represent God is according to His purpose, so that we will not all be the same. Did you know that the entirety of Midland is not in this room this morning? Look around. Is anybody missing? So that means that our representation of God has to take place in other places and times than this. And so you will be in places and you will be with people that none of the rest of us will. This week and the week after that. And the week the Lord gives you after that. Each of us are to connect, to be bridges between a people that need God, a people that know God, and knowing God. So Aaron is a wonderful example. Turn, if you would, to the book of Numbers, and we're going to look at two more of Aaron's famous mistakes. But here's the question that I would like you to contemplate. Last week we looked at Aaron's part in the fashioning of the golden calf. And the question was, what is Aaron's greatest sin? What's the sin that will keep him from the promised land? In the story in Exodus 32, we realize that it wasn't the golden calf, although that was a mistake. No question about it. But let's review a little bit about Aaron. He is Moses' 3-year older brother. These two brothers have stood before Pharaoh, the most powerful and most intimidating and frightening man on the planet from their perspective. He's the man that calls himself deity. The Pharaohs saw themselves as the incarnate God, the morning and the evening star. Anything they said was law. And God says to Moses, you're going to walk up to him and say, let my people go. You're not going to ask, you're not going to suggest, you're going to tell him on my behalf. And we know that Moses faltered and said, I can't do that. God said, then I'm going to give you your brother Aaron. And in my opinion, Aaron has the harder job. Because what God does is he tells Moses, you tell Pharaoh this and that. So Moses is hearing it from God. Moses turns to his brother Aaron and says, God says for you to tell Pharaoh this. So there's Aaron standing in front of Pharaoh. God says, let my people go. What's Moses doing? Standing next to Aaron. And tell him this. And this too. And tell him that. He better this too. And you better do that too. Look where Aaron's standing. Between Pharaoh and Moses. And those two brothers lead together. And they experience that together. The first 3 plagues, it's Aaron's rod that's lifted up to bring the plague. And so he has a partnership with his brother. It's not about who's superior. It's about brotherhood. It's about partnership. It's about 2 brothers standing back to back against the most powerful force in their world. And God works powerfully through brotherhood and through such fellowship. And then Pharaoh finally has to relent due to the power of God in the 10 plagues. And they lead the people out and they cross the Red Sea. And being a co-leader with Moses was so much fun. Because God's people were so grateful and so appreciative and so steadfast. Not over and over and over, there's this phrase, and they grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and they griped against Moses and Aaron, and they threatened to stone them all along the way. This is hard. I don't know, they might have reflected that it was easier talking to Pharaoh than dealing with these folks. So chapter 12 of Numbers is a second big mistake that Aaron makes. Because there's 2 brothers and a sister. Miriam is their sister. 3 siblings. Has anybody got good relationships with your siblings? Kind of one of those things where you could beat up and pick on each other, but nobody else can. That uniqueness and closeness of harassment among brothers and sisters that love each other, but boy, when trouble comes, they stand together. Kind of reminds me of Moses and Aaron and Miriam. But something goes wrong in chapter 12, verse 1. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman that he had married. And this is what they say in verse 2. Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? Now, I don't really know what's going on, but if you've ever been in a squabble with your brothers and sisters, you know that there's layers to issues, right? Because the text says they speak because he had married this Cushite woman. That's what the issue is supposed to be. But listen to what they say. Do they say you're married to the wrong woman? Is that what they say? No. Interesting, they say, has the Lord only spoken through Moses? He speaks to us too. Now what's that? That's not quite the same thing as we're concerned about your marriage, Moses. This feels like, hey, us too. We're a part of this. We're not chopped liver. We are important. So this sounds to me like there's a little bit of an image issue. really underneath this. Maybe that's why they are troubled by who he's married to. Maybe he's married beneath himself. Maybe that's where they're coming from. Because in the law of Moses, and about this marrying among the Jews, well, the law of Moses has not yet been written. So where are they coming from? What's the big deal? I don't know. But I remember the first brother-in-law at the table, and I didn't like him either. We've since gotten along real well. Maybe that's what's going on. But what's important is when they gripe about this, the last phrase of verse 2 says, "And the Lord heard it." Oh yeah, he sure did. Because we're told how humble Moses is. He's not going to defend himself, so God does. Verse 4, "Suddenly the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, 'You three come out to the tent of meeting.'" Now, this is originally written in Hebrew. If it was written in English, I think it would mean, "I'm pulling this car over." Or a derivative is, "Don't make me come back there." And that's what's just happened. These three are in a squabble, and God says, "The three of you, come to my house. We're going to have a talk." Oh boy. So they come to the tent of meeting. The Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the doorway of the tent. And he called Aaron and Miriam. And when they'd both come forward, he begins to tell them that he has a unique relationship with Moses. He underscores that Moses is his spokesman, his prophet, his servant. And don't be speaking against the one that I've chosen. Verse 9 says, "So the anger of the Lord burned against them, and he departed. But when the cloud had withdrawn from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous, as white as snow." A death sentence. A terrible death sentence. A horrific death sentence. Now, why wasn't Aaron struck with leprosy? Why weren't at least both of them struck with leprosy? Just Miriam. Well, I don't know. The text doesn't say, so now we're going to have to opinionate between the lines. It's possible that Miriam was the ringleader in this particular problem. The first verse of the chapter starts with her name, then Miriam and Aaron. Maybe it means she's kind of the spark in this particular problem, and that means Aaron's shortcoming is he's following again when he ought to be leading. Maybe that's what's the reason. It could also be that what is more devastating to you, to be sick or to have someone whom you love to be sick? Which is going to get your attention more? I don't know why exactly God gives Miriam leprosy and not Aaron, but those are a couple of possibilities. But watch Aaron. You see, when we talk about that Aaron is an example of being a priest, I don't know about you, but I am often overwhelmed. I am often reminded of how inadequate I am to represent God to anybody. What business do I have of trying to be a bridge or to be a connector when I can be pretty shaky myself? Well, Aaron's shaky occasionally also. He gets caught up in this grumbling and griping, the very thing that the other folks were doing constantly, he finds himself doing. But watch what happens. As Aaron turned toward Miriam, behold, she was leprous. Now, what does a brother do when he sees his sister stricken? They can squabble and they can gripe and they can be mad at each other, but when she's in trouble, what does a brother do? Aaron in verse 11 cries out to Moses, "Oh my Lord." That's a word that can be translated sir. It's a word for respect. Remember the squabble? Hey, God hadn't just spoken through Moses, but He's spoken to us too. All that evaporates in a heartbeat. He references Moses as Lord or as Master or as Sir or with respect, because all of a sudden what matters is Miriam. He says, "Oh, my Lord, I beg you, do not account this sin to us in which we have acted foolishly and in which we have sinned. Oh, do not let her be like the one who is dead, whose flesh is eaten half away when he comes from his mother's womb." And now Moses is no different. He hits the ground next and he asks God essentially the same thing. Both brothers fall down and say, "Please, please rescue her." The squabbling, the division, the who's more important than the other evaporates. They don't care about that. Just let her be okay. God is still pretty severe about the need for her to learn something. And she's got to be put outside the camp. Again, it sounds like maybe this one started with Miriam and Aaron's problem is getting swept away. Aaron makes a mistake. Grumbles against God's chosen. But look at his response as a priest, as an intercessor, as someone pleading on the behalf of someone else. Aaron gets an experience of pure intercession, pure priesthood, just pleading for someone else. Look in chapter 14. The people complain some more, Numbers 14. Because Aaron sins, but that's not what cost him the promised land. They send out spies, they come back and say there's no way we can go into the promised land. And listen to how the people of Israel grumble. It says, verse 2, they grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And then they begin to say, "Oh, if we had only died in the land of Egypt. Why would we die in this wilderness? Why is the Lord bringing us into this land?" How about this? "It is not better for us, isn't it, to return to Egypt?" Yeah, where we spent the last 400 years begging for rescue. Remember the part about being enslaved? Remember the bricks? See, the problem is their promised land is behind them when it's in truth in front of them. When we spend all of our time looking behind us, there's no life now. There's no future because it's frozen, it's paralyzed, it's poisoned by the past. When we think the good old days were behind us, then we no longer walk in faith. Because what you're saying is, so God's done with us. There's nothing else. But every time that God gives us breath, there's another thing yet to be done. The promised land is ahead of us. Look at verse 5. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces in the presence of all the assembly of the congregation. One of the things that you consistently watch Moses and Aaron do is they won't defend themselves. They'll wait on God to defend them. Would you look over at verse 30? I wished I'd have been standing there and watching Moses and Aaron's face. Was there a flicker of recognition across their face? Because as usual, Moses and Aaron plead for God's people. They plead for mercy. They intercede. They beg God's favor upon these stubborn people. But God says this in verse 30 as he speaks about the people. "Surely you shall not come into the land which I swore to settle you, except Caleb and Joshua." What God has said is, because of your lack of unbelief, you're not going to come into the promised land. You think it's behind you, that's where it's going to be. The one in front of you, that'll be for your children. He says the only two that enter the promised land is Joshua and Caleb. When does Moses and Aaron look at each other and say, "Wait a minute, don't you mean 4? It's the first time we get this foreshadow of, uh-oh. You telling me that Moses, the great Moses, and Aaron his brother, that they are not going to experience the promised land that they have been giving so much to help others reach? Well, God just said the two people in this generation that will be in the promised land is Joshua and Caleb. Turn, if you would, to chapter 16. I don't know if this was deja vu for Aaron, but in chapter 16, Korah and those with him begin to rebel. And they say something similar. Hey, we're priests too. God is not just working through Moses and Aaron. Verse 2, the last part says, 250 leaders of the congregation, chosen in the assembly, men of renowned, powerful, respected men, rise up against Moses and Aaron in verse 3. And they say, as they assemble against Moses and Aaron, you have gone far enough. For all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is in their midst. So why do you exalt yourself above the assembly of the Lord? There's such a thing as callous knees from praying. I wonder if there's callous faces from falling on them. Because verse 4 says, when Moses heard this, he fell on his face. This is like constant. Every time Moses and Aaron turn around, there's some kind of rebellion. There's some kind of mutiny. Moses responds in verse 11 of chapter 16, therefore you and all your company are gathered together against the Lord. But as for Aaron, who is he that you grumble against him? So here's my question. How long are you, Aaron, before this starts to bug you? How long? Over and over and over. People gripe. People complain. They grumble. You're just trying to help. You're doing the best you can. God's the one that told you to do it. It's not your fault. Those aren't your words. And those people want to eat you every time you turn around. When do you say, I'm done? You obviously don't want God, and I don't want you. I'm done. There is something about the power of steadfast faithfulness, of just taking another step, of just continuing to go. Look at verse 13. This is incredible. They gripe to Moses and they say, we're not going to listen. This is what they say in verse 13. Is it not enough that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey? What? The phrase milk and honey is a cultural expression about everything's coming up roses. That's another one. It's about everything being wonderful and awesome and great and comfortable. And they just use the expression for the promised land to describe Egypt. You led us out of a land flowing with milk and honey, just to die in the wilderness, and now you want to lord it over us too. Verse 14, indeed, you have not brought us into the land flowing with milk and honey. You've not given us an inheritance. We're not coming. Whew. I'm ready to quit for Aaron. I'm ready to say, I'm not doing this. Now, this is the most challenging part, in my opinion, is verse 20. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, and he said, separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them instantly. And I say, yeah, sick 'em, Lord, get 'em. Wouldn't you? Because you're walking in a relationship with God. You're doing what He's called you to do. It's been so hard, and these people are just biting and gnashing and chewing on you all the time, and they are sinning. And they come at you again. We don't have to follow you. Egypt is a better place. We don't have to listen to you. And God says, back up, boys. I'm going to fry them. I'd bring marshmallows. Would you? Say, thank you, Lord. Thank you. But this is the heart of a priest right here. See, when Peter says we're all priests, what does that look like? Right here. Right here. Verse 22. But they fell on their faces, and they said, oh God, God of the spirits of all flesh, when one man sins, will you be angry with the entire congregation? And yet again, they plead for people. They intercede. Do you realize they stand between God's wrath and those who deserve it? In fact, He opens up the ground that swallows Korah and those who follow him. Fire comes forth and begins to consume the 250. And you know what Aaron does? Because after the ground consumes Korah, and after this incredible plague of wrath in verse 41, but on the next day, all the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron and said, "You've caused the death of the Lord's people. When do you say, you bunch of turkeys? You don't know, if I hadn't have pleaded yesterday for you, you'd all be just crispy critters by now." See, that's not the heart of a priest. It came about in verse 42 that when the congregation assembled against Moses and Aaron, they turned toward the tent of meeting. That's where you go when it gets hard to be a priest. The Lord spoke to Moses again in verse 45, "Get away from this congregation that I may consume them instantly." And they fell on their faces. Moses said to Aaron, "Take your censer, put it in the fire from the altar, and lay incense on it, and bring it quickly to the congregation, and make atonement for them, for wrath has gone forth from the Lord, the plague has begun." God said, "Back up, I'm done." And he brings this wrath, and Moses says to Aaron, "Hurry, hurry, make atonement, be a substitution, get in between God's wrath and those who deserve it." I don't know about you, but if I'm Aaron, I'm like, "Okay, I'm hurrying. I'll get right to that." Then Aaron took it as Moses had spoken and ran into the midst of the assembly. For behold, the plague had begun among the people. He put on the incense and he made atonement for the people. He took his stand between the dead and the living so that the plague was checked. Oh! That's something. Aaron can't stop God. But do you realize as God is reaching out in the plague, God reaches out and Aaron's like, "No, Lord, don't. Lord, don't. And God has said, "Move. This is just." Now, this is not God having a bad day. This is justice. This is righteousness. This is holiness. And Aaron's like, "No, God, don't. And because of Aaron, one man, God says, "Okay." Over and over, Moses and Aaron have fell on their faces, and God's people have been blessed because of a priest who stood between, acted as a bridge, who was a connector when it was hard. And then the last piece in chapter 20. Chapter 20. Moses is still going to the promised land until chapter 20. What happened? Now you're Aaron and you have over and over stood between God. You have risked your life. Would you like to run out in the middle of people and put yourself in front of God's plague? Aaron does. Over and over they plead for these people that God would spare these people. And then in chapter 20 verse 1, then the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Zin in the first month. And it says, now Miriam died there and was buried there. Many of you this morning have lost a sibling. I have not as yet. So you'll have to tell me, what's it like to mourn a sibling? What's it like to sit in a funeral service and that's your brother or your sister? I don't know. But many of you do. Miriam has just passed away. So you tell me what Moses and Aaron are talking about and what they're thinking about. Verse 2. There was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron. They are just out of the mourning period for Miriam. You tell me how Moses and Aaron feel, and what does the congregation do next? The same old stuff. When your heart has been rended by grief, what do you want to say when this congregation grumbles and gripes? It says in verse 3, the people thus contended, they fought with, they argued with, they picked a fight with Moses and Aaron. If only we'd perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. This is said in the context of the meal after a funeral for Miriam. In verse 6, Moses and Aaron came in from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. The glory of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, "Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, assemble the congregation and speak to the rock that it may yield forth its water." This is, someday I'm going to go back and count how many times they grumble against Moses and Aaron, but it's constant. Verse 9. So they gathered the congregation. Moses took the rod from before the Lord, just as he had been commanded him, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock. Remember, they're contending, they're fighting, they're saying, "We don't have any water, we're going to die. I can't believe you brought us out here." And there's a fresh grave in the background. So you got to gather them up. Come on. Whoa, why we got to come? You're always, come on, just come on. You got to bring them. You got to say stuff. You got to get people there. So what do you say? They get there, verse 10. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock, and he said to them, "Listen now, you rebels." Did you hear the crack in his voice? Sometimes you just get fed up. This is the congregation that God loves. This is the congregation that Moses loves, because Moses has offered his life in exchange for them numerous times. When they worship the golden calf, Moses falls down and says, "Blot my name out of your book, only let them still be in your favor." Moses offers his own salvation for them. But sometimes you can just get worn out over and over and over. Listen, you rebels. I don't think it's just word choice. I think his voice pitch cracks, changes. He's on a ragged edge. They can't even grieve their own sister before they're having to deal with this again. They've already gotten water from a rock. God's already solved this problem before. Oh. Listen now, you rebels. Shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted up his hand, and he struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you have not believed me, to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land to which I have given them." Well, what do you think about that? Aaron fashioned a golden calf, and God still was going to let him go into the promised land. Aaron grumbled against Moses and had struck Miriam with leprosy, but he still was going to allow him to go into the promised land. All of a sudden, God says, "Oh, you're not, no. You and Moses." This cost Moses and Aaron their entrance into the promised land. See, I don't know about you, but I would have thought the golden calf was worse. So what happened? God said, "You didn't believe me. You didn't treat me as holy." You know what my second favorite part about this story is? If Moses has done wrong, he wasn't supposed to strike the rock. He was just supposed to speak, right? And he's all stirred up, and they're just mourning their sister, and these people are so like, and so he does the wrong thing. In his own frustration, he strikes the rock. You know what God does? God backs his play. Isn't that something? Why didn't God go, "Oh, you ain't getting water now"? You realize God made water come from a rock, and Moses is messed up. It's so seriously that he can't go in the promised land. But in the middle of messing up, you know what God did? God backed his play. He said, "I got your back. We're going to talk about this later, but I got you." In a crowd of people that he's gathered up, and they're all mad, and they're all against him, what would have happened if Moses hadn't have delivered? So God still provides, not only for the people, but for Moses when he's messing up. I think where it went wrong was not just hitting the rock. I go back to his words in verse 10. Listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? He doesn't even mention the Lord. The very accusation they made all the time, you're lording it over us. You think you're something special. Over and over, Moses and Aaron said, no, it's God. No, it's God. No, it's God. For the first time, they blew it like, yeah, this is us. God said, you didn't believe me and you didn't treat me as holy. Verse 23. It's the last paragraph in Aaron's life. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron. He's been doing this now since Egypt. And he said, Aaron will be gathered to his people, for he shall not enter the land which I have given to the sons of Israel, because you rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah. Take Aaron and his son Eleazar, and bring them up to Mount Or, and strip Aaron of his garments, and put them on his son Eleazar. So Aaron will be gathered to his people and will die there. It's been a while. When God came to Moses in the burning bush and said, you got to go to Egypt, Moses says, can't do it. That's all right. You got a brother, and he's going to be glad to see you. And he's going to stand by you. He's going to be your wingman. He's going to be back to back with you. And those two brothers stand before Pharaoh. And they say it, and they say it. And then they league together. And you know, late at night, they're in their tent talking about the day's events. Well, that's the last time that they've offered to kill us or to stone us, or they can't stand us, or there's a rebellion. They live through all of that together. Two brothers and a sister. And then they've got to go up on the mountain. And there's Aaron standing there in his priesthood garments. And Moses tells him, I've got to take these off, and I'm going to give it to your son Eleazar. He's going to be the people's priest, and that's good. God could have just, that's it. No, Aaron has to reach over Aaron's shoulders and undo the clasp and take the mantle off. He's got to be right there, look him right in the eye and say, brother, I got to take this off. And he takes that off, and he puts it on the son. And there the son standing there right next to his dad. And Moses has got to look him right in the eye and say, brother, it's been good, brother. We've been through so much. I don't know if they reflected on the victories that they'd had in faith, or whether Moses looks him in the eye when he reaches around and gets the next piece and takes it off of Aaron. But there's a time when Aaron's wearing one last piece, and they both know what's about to happen. Moses has got to walk up to him, look him right in the eye and say, brother, I love you. You've always been there for me. We'd have never made it this far if you hadn't have been there for me. And he takes the last piece off, and Aaron collapses. That's it. Puts it on the son who's standing there, wearing the priestly garments that are still warm from his father's heat. And he's gone. And they're going to mourn Aaron, the first high priest of the people of Israel. A flawed man, but a tenaciously faithful man. Made some mistakes, but he hung in there. Made a practice of falling on his face. He didn't get to go into the promised land. Moses leads them up to it. He doesn't get to go either. He gets to see it. And then the young man Joshua will lead them in. And they will gripe, and they will grumble, and they will fuss from then on. Now let me ask you a question. When Moses died on that mountaintop, was he punished? I know that he didn't get to enter the promised land. He didn't go into the promised land with a congregation of grumbling, griping, rebellious, and stubborn people. You know what happened next? Welcome home, thou good and faithful servant. Because centuries later, David in the Psalms, Stephen in the book of Acts will refer to him as the Holy One of God, the chosen one, God's priest. All throughout the Bible from there on, he will be the example of the priest. In fact, he'll be described as a forerunner of Jesus Christ himself. So Moses walks down the mountain with his eyes downcast, kicking rocks, walking along with his nephew, the new priest. Aaron's body laid to rest on the top of the mountain. And he comes down from the mountain, and in the next chapter, there's trouble. And I wonder if Moses doesn't look over his shoulder up at the mountain and say, "Lucky dog." It's true that Aaron made a mistake, and he will not enter the promised land, but he got to go home. So I don't know. Maybe Moses was punished because he had to stay behind a little bit longer. To have the heart of a priest is to plead for people and to care for them. And this morning, that's what we do. We want to plead for you. We invite you to come forward this morning. You can sit on one of these front pews, or you can go out into the foyer with a shepherd. And we will plead for you as a nation, as a congregation, as a family of priests. Because we occasionally grumble and gripe too, but we will plead for each other. God loves you. Can we help you in any way? We invite you to come as together we stand and sing.